Vanessa Caldwell lifted Daniel's soup and poured it across the white linen before 80 silent guests. Daniel watched his daughter's red recipe card float in the spill, but he kept his hands still. The hotel CEO called his food a charity stunt and ordered security to clear the ballroom. Then her father Arthur rose from the head table, gripping the chair as if it were a rail. He did not defend Daniel with money. He asked who had altered the kitchen's allergy log. That question stopped security, frightened one executive, and turned a public insult into a reckoning. 6 hours earlier, Daniel Mercer had balanced a grocery receipt against the childcare calendar taped beside his refrigerator. His 10-year-old daughter Lily needed him at her school showcase by 7, while the Harbor Light Hotel needed 300 gala portions before 6. Daniel promised Lily he would arrive before her presentation, then folded her small red recipe card into his shirt pocket. The card held Maya's handwritten tomato-basil soup, the last recipe Daniel's wife had perfected before cancer took her. He carried it because hard days felt less lonely when her handwriting rested near his heart. Daniel reached the Harbor Light kitchen before dawn and found the loading door chained from the inside. A junior porter named Matteo let him through after checking the delivery list twice. Executive Director Gordon Pike had removed Daniel's community kitchen from the authorized vendor sheet overnight. Daniel could have driven away and protected his afternoon, but 80 scholarship families were expecting the first course he had promised. He called his assistant, rerouted the produce through the public café, and began cooking in borrowed stock pots while the hotel staff watched him turn inconvenience into order. The gala contract mattered because Daniel's neighborhood café, second table, was 3 late invoices from closing. He employed parents who needed predictable shifts, including Matteo's sister Rosa, and losing the hotel payment would cost more than Daniel's pride. Gordon entered wearing a silver tie and inspected the improvised station without touching anything. He told Daniel that small vendors often confused generosity with competence. Daniel answered by showing temperature logs, labeled ingredients, and a color-coded service plan, but Gordon photographed only the borrowed pots and sent the image to Vanessa Caldwell. Vanessa arrived expecting a clean rehearsal and found steam rolling from the public cafe. She was 38, precise, and newly responsible for the hotel group after her father Arthur's stroke. Daniel saw exhaustion behind her authority, yet her first question was why an unauthorized cook had occupied her lobby kitchen. Gordon supplied the answer before Daniel could speak, calling second table a sentimental favor Arthur had arranged. Daniel offered the signed contract, but Vanessa saw her father's initials and assumed another private promise had bypassed her. She ordered a formal review after the gala and allowed service only under Gordon's supervision. Lily called during Daniel's first tasting. Her teacher had moved the showcase earlier because a storm warning threatened the buses, although the sky over the city remained bright. Daniel looked at the clock, then at 300 bowls still waiting for garnish. He asked Rosa to record Lily's presentation if he missed the opening, and the silence on the phone hurt more than Lily's disappointed answer. Fatherhood did not make his choices noble. It made every choice cost someone he loved. Daniel tucked the red card beneath the service clipboard and returned to the stove with less certainty than before. Arthur Caldwell entered the kitchen using a cane and refused the chair Vanessa offered. Daniel recognized him as a quiet man who had eaten at second table twice the previous winter, but he had never learned the man's surname. Arthur tasted the soup, studied Daniel's face, and asked whether the recipe always carried smoked paprika. Daniel said Maya had added it after Lily once complained that grief made everything taste pale. Arthur smiled, then abruptly coughed and reached for water. Gordon moved between them, claiming the kitchen was too chaotic for Arthur, and escorted him toward the ballroom. Daniel checked the tasting spoon, the ingredient bin, and the printed allergy sheet before he resumed service. The sheet listed dairy in the soup even though Maya's recipe contained none, while the dessert line omitted pistachios that Daniel had seen delivered. He marked both errors in red and showed Vanessa, expecting concern. She saw another challenge to her authority minutes before donors arrived and told him Gordon's compliance team had approved every page. Daniel asked her to verify the source file, but she said the event could not be rebuilt around one vendor's suspicion. Gordon quietly replaced the sheet. The first guests entered beneath gold banners, promising that every child deserved a seat at the table. Daniel noticed the irony but kept his attention on service. He trained banquet servers to describe the soup accurately, set aside allergen-safe bowls, and placed Matteo at the pass with a fresh log. Vanessa watched Daniel redirect a confused server without humiliation. a contrast Daniel hoped she noticed. When a donor demanded a special plate without notice, Daniel solved it in 4 minutes using ingredients already isolated for safety. Gordon praised the hotel team and left Daniel's name out entirely. Rosa sent Daniel a short video from Lily's school. Lily stood beside a cardboard model of second table, explaining that her father believed dignity began when nobody had to ask twice for food. The class applauded, but the empty chair beside Rosa remained visible. Daniel nearly handed the ladle to Matteo and left. Then the ballroom captain reported that Gordon had ordered the safe bowls mixed back into general service to speed plating. Daniel closed the pass, accepting the risk of public delay, because a promise to Lily meant nothing if he abandoned the principle she had described. Vanessa confronted Daniel beside the swinging doors while guests waited. He showed her the 2 conflicting allergy sheets and the timestamps Matteo had recorded. Gordon claimed Daniel had created the discrepancy to justify his own delay. Vanessa could cancel the course, protect the gala schedule, and blame the outside vendor, or stop service and embarrass the hotel. She chose a 5-minute hold and personally called the compliance manager. It was her first decision against Gordon, small but costly, because 80 donors could see the stalled servers. Daniel reopened only after the safe bowls were separated again. Service recovered, and the soup reached the room warm. Arthur took 1 spoonful, then stared at the red recipe card Daniel had clipped above the pass. Gordon noticed the exchange and whispered to Vanessa before crossing the ballroom. He told her Daniel planned to announce that Arthur had secretly funded second table, turning the gala into publicity for a struggling café. Vanessa had spent 2 years fighting accusations that her father treated the company as a private charity. She approached Daniel already braced for manipulation and asked him to remove his café cards from every table, although Daniel had placed none there. Daniel searched the place settings and found glossy cards bearing his logo beside 12 influential donors. The printing was expensive, the slogan was wrong, and the paper came from the hotel's own business center. He collected them instead of arguing, but Gordon raised his voice so nearby tables could hear. Gordon asked how much free advertising Daniel expected from a memorial recipe and whether Lily had written the sob story. Daniel's restraint narrowed into anger when his daughter became ammunition. He told Gordon to leave Lily out of it, and that single raised sentence gave Vanessa the image Gordon wanted. Vanessa lifted a bowl from the service table and demanded to know whether the course was food or leverage. Daniel said it was a promise to scholarship families and asked her to inspect the original contract. Gordon replied that desperate vendors always carried paperwork. The crowd's attention tightened around them, phones rising above shoulders. Vanessa poured the soup across the linen, called the presentation a charity stunt, and ordered security forward. The red recipe card slid from Daniel's clipboard into the spill. Daniel held his hands still because Lily would someday see whatever happened next. Arthur rose before security reached Daniel. His cane struck the floor once, and the ballroom became quiet enough to hear the service doors swing. Arthur asked who had altered the allergy log, then requested the archived source file from the compliance server. Vanessa tried to guide him back to his chair, but Arthur said the question belonged to her now. Gordon claimed the discrepancy had already been corrected. Arthur answered that correction without an audit trail was deletion, not safety. Daniel realized the old man from his cafe had never visited only for soup. Vanessa canceled the next course and moved the gala program into the lounge. It cost the hotel prestige, but it gave staff time to preserve the kitchen records before anyone could overwrite them. She asked Daniel to stay as a witness, not as a vendor, and told security to secure the business center printer. Daniel agreed only after Matteo confirmed the safe meals had reached every family. Vanessa retrieved the soaked red card with clean tongs and placed it on a dry tray. The gesture did not repair the insult, but it showed she understood where the deepest damage had landed. In a small conference room, the compliance manager opened the server archive. The original soup sheet matched Daniel's recipe, while the pistachio warning had vanished in a revision made from Gordon's credentials. Gordon said an assistant must have used his login. Daniel pointed out that the fake promotional cards and the altered sheets shared the same printer batch code. Vanessa did not celebrate the connection. She asked for access logs, camera records, and every invoice tied to the gala. Her questions became sharper as the evidence shifted from one cruel scene toward a system someone had built. Arthur explained that Second Table had not received secret funding. Months earlier, He had visited anonymously after a rehabilitation appointment and watched Daniel feed a laid-off dishwasher who could not pay. Daniel had refused Arthur's large tip and asked him instead to sponsor kitchen training for parents returning to work. Arthur later created the gala contract through the normal foundation committee, but Gordon had delayed it until the café became desperate. The withheld truth was not that Daniel possessed hidden status. It was that Arthur had been testing whether Harbor Lights still rewarded service or merely displayed it. Daniel wanted to leave for Lily's school, yet Vanessa asked for 20 minutes to reconstruct the timeline. He called Lily and admitted he had missed her presentation. Lily said Rosa had recorded it, but Daniel heard the careful bravery children use when protecting adults. He promised no excuse, only breakfast together and the truth when he returned. After the call, he told Vanessa that 20 minutes was all she had. That boundary changed their relationship more than any grateful speech could have, because Vanessa saw that her emergency did not automatically outrank his daughter. The printer logs showed Gordon had produced the false café cards after photographing Daniel's borrowed station. Camera footage placed his assistant at the compliance terminal, but the assistant had clocked out before the edit. Vanessa froze access to the gala accounts and called outside counsel, risking a public scandal during her first major event as CEO. Gordon warned that donors would punish instability. Vanessa replied that hiding instability had already endangered guests. Daniel watched her choose institutional pain over cosmetic calm, the first meaningful proof that she could become more than the person who had humiliated him. Gordon changed tactics and accused Arthur of engineering the crisis to remove him. He reminded Vanessa that her father had often ignored budgets for personal causes. Arthur did not deny his history. He admitted that generous instincts had sometimes become private commands, leaving Vanessa to manage consequences she had not chosen. Daniel understood why she had mistaken his contract for another intrusion. Arthur apologized to Vanessa in front of the people affected, not as a performance, but as an acknowledgement of the pattern Gordon had exploited. That honesty removed Gordon's strongest shield. Vanessa asked Daniel to return to the ballroom and explain the service delay. He refused to become proof that the hotel had solved itself in one evening. He would state only that safety concerns required a pause and that every guest had received verified food. Vanessa accepted the limit and delivered the harder explanation herself. She told 80 guests that she had publicly judged a vendor before checking the records and that the hotel would publish an independent review. The room did not applaud immediately. Daniel respected that silence because accountability was not supposed to feel triumphant. Lily arrived with Rosa after the school buses were canceled. She carried her cardboard model under one arm and stopped when she saw soup across the white linen. Daniel knelt to meet her eyes and told her the spill was not an accident. He did not soften his own missed promise or Vanessa's action. Lily asked whether he had yelled back. Daniel said he had wanted to, then showed her the preserved bowls and explained why he closed the pass. She answered that keeping people safe counted, but he still owed her a front-row seat next time. Vanessa approached Lily without the executive smile she used for donors. She returned the red recipe card inside a clear protective sleeve and said, "I treated something precious like a prop." Lily did not forgive her on command. She asked why Vanessa had believed Gordon instead of her father. Vanessa said fear of being controlled had made her easy to control, and that answer was honest enough to leave the question open. Lily took the card, then asked whether the Gala families had eaten. When Vanessa said yes, Lily nodded once and stayed beside Daniel. The gala resumed without the planned speeches. Daniel served a simple second pot of soup from ingredients still under his control, and Vanessa stood at the pass checking labels with Mateo. Her presence changed nothing by itself, but she followed Daniel's system instead of demanding a faster one. Arthur sat with Lily and listened to her explain the cardboard café. Gordon remained in the conference room while counsel preserved his devices. The evening no longer looked polished, yet the scholarship families received food, donors saw the real work, and staff began speaking openly about earlier shortcuts. After the last guest left, Daniel found a voicemail from his landlord granting only 10 days before the cafe lease defaulted. The gala payment was now frozen with the disputed accounts. Vanessa offered an advance from her personal funds, but Daniel refused because private rescue would repeat Arthur's old pattern. He asked instead for the uncontested portion of the invoice and a written schedule for the rest. Vanessa called finance in front of him and authorized the legitimate payment through an emergency vendor process. Daniel accepted because transparent procedure protected both of them better than gratitude. At second table the next morning, Lily placed her school model on the counter and demanded the promised front-row breakfast. Daniel made pancakes while she replayed her presentation on Rosa's phone. He watched every second without touching the cafe paperwork. When the video ended, Lily asked whether rich people were always mean when scared. Daniel said fear could explain a choice but could not pay for its damage. He promised they would decide together how much contact to keep with Harbor Light, turning fatherhood from a sentimental label into a real limit on his ambition. Vanessa visited the cafe alone before opening and waited outside until Daniel unlocked the door. She brought no check and no press team. Instead, she carried a draft notice preserving every gala worker's job during the investigation and asked Daniel to identify safety gaps without signing a publicity release. He agreed to a paid, 2-day audit if Mateo and Rosa joined the review. Vanessa accepted their rates without bargaining. Lily watched from a booth, measuring Vanessa by whether she listened when Daniel named conditions. The first test of trust ended without warmth, but it ended fairly. The audit revealed that Gordon had centralized purchasing approvals under his office, then punished kitchens that reported substitutions. Daniel traced repeated missing allergen warnings to vendors connected with a consulting company Gordon controlled through his brother. His cooking experience helped him see where paperwork contradicted actual workflow, but he could not interpret the corporate ownership records. Vanessa supplied that expertise and admitted what she did not know. Their competence became complementary rather than competitive. Every discovery created a new risk, because exposing the scheme could close 2 hotel kitchens and eliminate the jobs Daniel wanted protected. Mateo disclosed that Gordon had threatened to cancel his work authorization sponsorship if he documented shortages. Daniel wanted to take the statement directly to regulators, but Mateo feared losing housing tied to the job. Vanessa proposed independent counsel paid through a protected employee fund, with Mateo choosing the attorney. Daniel asked whether she could guarantee no retaliation. She said she could guarantee consequences for retaliation, not control every frightened manager. The distinction mattered. Mateo agreed to speak after Vanessa moved his housing lease out of Gordon's chain of command, her second plot-changing action and a concrete risk to the company. Arthur invited Daniel to lunch and confessed that he had suspected Gordon's procurement numbers for months. He had lacked proof and had hoped the gala contract would reveal whether frontline staff still reported problems. Daniel was angry that Arthur had let ordinary workers become part of an unannounced test. Arthur accepted the criticism and did not call the outcome necessary. He gave Daniel the board calendar, then stepped back from directing the investigation. The red recipe card lay drying beneath a glass weight nearby, ordinary handwriting now linked to a choice about how power should be used. Gordon's attorneys sent Daniel a letter accusing him of theft of confidential records. The claim was weak, but answering it would consume money he did not have. Vanessa offered company counsel, and Daniel refused because the same company might later protect itself at his expense. Lily heard enough to understand that the cafe could close. She suggested selling her school model online, and Daniel felt the consequence of bringing institutional conflict home. He told her adults would handle the money, then spent the night contacting a legal clinic rather than pretending confidence he did not possess. Rosa organized the cafe staff to cover Daniel's morning service while he met the clinic attorney. Their choice showed that his years of predictable schedules and shared tips had built something stronger than personal heroism. The attorney found a whistleblower defense if Daniel could prove the records reached him during authorized work. Mateo's time-stamped photographs and Vanessa's written audit contract supplied that proof. Daniel did not defeat the threat alone. A system of small, documented acts protected him. He began to see that accepting help could preserve dignity when the terms remained visible. Vanessa faced her board that afternoon. Daniel attended only for the safety segment and sat in the public vendor chair rather than beside Arthur. Gordon presented declining revenue projections and called the investigation an emotional overreaction to spilled soup. Vanessa displayed the access logs, false cards, vendor connections, and Mateo's protected statement. 2 directors urged a quiet settlement to prevent lenders from reacting. Vanessa refused and requested an outside monitor, knowing the decision could cost her position. Daniel saw her stake something she actually valued, completing another rung in the trust ladder. The board suspended Gordon, but delayed removing him pending the monitor's report. Outside the meeting, Reporters surrounded Daniel and asked whether Arthur had promised him a hotel restaurant. Daniel said no, then redirected every question toward worker safety and verified labels. A producer offered Lily a televised interview about the red card. Daniel declined before asking the fee, because Lily's grief was not evidence for sale. Vanessa reinforced his refusal, even though the interview might improve the hotel's image. Their agreement protected Lily and revealed a shared boundary neither had possessed at the gala. For 1 week, Second Table became crowded with strangers who had seen a phone video of Vanessa pouring the soup. Some came to support Daniel. Others came hoping to film conflict. Daniel prohibited recording near Lily's booth and asked customers to buy meals for themselves rather than leave theatrical tips. The attention increased revenue but disturbed the cafe's rhythm. He learned that public sympathy could objectify him as easily as public contempt. Vanessa offered security, and Daniel accepted only one plainclothes guard during school hours, a practical compromise shaped by Lily's safety rather than his pride. The outside monitor discovered that Gordon's scheme extended beyond invoices. He had diverted scholarship meal funds into inflated consulting payments, then used understaffing to make the program appear unsustainable. The gala humiliation had been designed to discredit Daniel before Daniel could compare actual portions with budgeted amounts. Arthur's question about the allergy log had frightened Gordon because the same revisions concealed substitutions throughout the program. The deeper answer emerged through records, worker testimony, and repeated patterns, not through one convenient confession. Daniel's original kindness had placed him where he could recognize the human cost of the fraud. Vanessa visited Lily's school showcase room after asking permission from both Lily and the teacher. She listened while Lily presented the model again to a small class, giving Daniel the front row seat he had missed. Vanessa did not take the microphone or donate anything. Afterward, she asked Lily how the model handled people who could not pay. Lily showed a sliding wooden token that protected privacy at checkout. Vanessa realized Harbor Light scholarship dinners required families to stand in a marked line. She asked Lily whether the hotel could borrow the idea, giving the child agency without turning her into a mascot. Daniel and Vanessa redesigned the next scholarship meal around identical tokens. Their first planning session became tense when Vanessa proposed premium sponsor tables beside the family section. Daniel argued that the layout would recreate the hierarchy the program claimed to remove. Vanessa initially defended donor expectations, then asked the event team to test one shared seating plan. She changed the decision before Daniel threatened to leave, demonstrating that trust could alter behavior in real time. Daniel, in turn, accepted reserved accessibility seating after Vanessa explained needs he had overlooked. Neither person became infallible for the relationship to deepen. Gordon contacted Daniel privately and offered enough money to save Second Table if Daniel blamed the altered logs on a junior manager. Daniel recorded nothing because state law required consent, but he immediately wrote a detailed account and called his attorney. Gordon invoked Lily, warning that public litigation would make her school life unbearable. Daniel nearly accepted a quiet exit from the conflict. Then he saw the red card under its glass sleeve and remembered Maya correcting recipes by naming mistakes instead of hiding them. He refused the deal, though the refusal left the cafe's lease unresolved. When Daniel told Vanessa about the offer, she asked why he had not brought a witness. Her frustration sounded like accusation, and he withdrew. She recognized the damage but did not demand immediate forgiveness. Instead, she asked the monitor to arrange protected communication channels for every witness, repairing the system rather than explaining her tone. Daniel later admitted that shame had made him meet Gordon alone. Their small vulnerabilities arrived without romance or rescue. Each learned how fear changed the other's behavior, and that knowledge became a responsibility rather than a weapon. The landlord posted the final lease notice on Second Table's door during lunch service. Customers offered to crowdfund the balance, but Daniel would not build the cafe's future on one viral week. Rosa proposed converting part of the business into a worker cooperative, using contracts from schools and hospitals to stabilize revenue. Daniel had always treated ownership as his last connection to Maya, so sharing it felt like another loss. Lily asked whether keeping Maya's table mattered more than keeping everyone's jobs. Her question forced fatherhood into the central decision, not merely the emotional background. Daniel agreed to explore the cooperative if every worker received independent advice. Vanessa connected Rosa with a nonprofit development center but declined to sit in negotiations. She understood that her presence and resources could distort consent. Arthur offered to buy the building, and Daniel rejected the plan for the same reason he had rejected Vanessa's personal advance. Instead, Arthur introduced the landlord to a community property trust and left the terms to professionals. Power became useful only after its owner accepted limits. The possible solution remained uncertain, preserving a real cost through the story's middle. The Monitor scheduled a public hearing with hotel workers, scholarship families, and board members. Gordon's team released edited footage showing Daniel raising his voice before the soup was poured. Online commentary shifted, and cafe traffic fell as quickly as it had risen. Lily came home after a classmate repeated that Daniel had staged the scene. Daniel considered withdrawing from the hearing to protect her. Lily said hiding would let someone else tell the story, but she asked him not to show her recipe card on television. He promised the card would remain private, honoring her boundary over evidentiary theater. At the hearing, Daniel described the kitchen hold, the conflicting sheets, and his own anger without presenting himself as perfectly calm. Vanessa testified next and stated plainly that she had poured the soup. Her lawyers had advised passive language, yet she rejected phrases like, "the bowl was overturned." She accepted responsibility before explaining Gordon's manipulation. That choice prevented him from using her shame as leverage. Mateo and Rosa then documented how pressure moved from budgets into unsafe service. The narrative shifted from one viral humiliation to a pattern whose victims could speak for themselves. Gordon produced an email suggesting Arthur wanted Daniel installed as a consultant before the gala. Arthur confirmed the email and admitted he had recommended Daniel after observing second table. The disclosure embarrassed Vanessa because her suspicion had contained a piece of truth. Daniel clarified that he never received the message and would not accept a role created without open competition. The Monitor verified both statements. By refusing an easy advantage, Daniel protected the legitimacy of the investigation but lost the consulting income that could have saved his lease. His moral choice carried immediate financial weight. The board chair proposed resolving the scandal by firing Gordon, paying fines, and ending the scholarship meal program. Removing the program would reduce risk and erase the vulnerable families from the balance sheet. Vanessa opposed the plan, but several directors warned they would remove her as CEO if she continued. She requested a recess and found Daniel in the service corridor. Daniel told her the program should not survive merely as Arthur's legacy. It needed worker safeguards, transparent prices, and family input. Vanessa returned with a reform plan rather than a defensive sentiment. The directors rejected the first plan as too expensive. Vanessa could preserve her title by accepting the shutdown and quietly support second table later. Instead, she offered to step down if the board refused an independent safety committee with worker and family seats. It was her reciprocal costly action, made without knowing whether Daniel would stay in her life or whether Arthur approved. Arthur did not rescue her with a controlling vote. He asked each director to answer the proposal on its merits. Two employees watching from the gallery began the pressure that changed the room. Daniel spoke only after the chair invited public comment. He explained how predictable schedules, honest labels, and dignified service reduced costs that spreadsheets often hid. He did not ask the board to keep Vanessa. He asked them to adopt measurable protections any CEO would have to follow. Lily's token system became one example, credited to the families and school children who had tested it rather than to a heroic executive. The clarity of the proposal gave hesitant directors a path to support reform without pretending trust had already returned. The vote passed by 1. Gordon was removed and referred to investigators after the Monitor documented fraud and retaliation. Vanessa remained CEO under quarterly oversight, a condition she publicly welcomed. The hotel paid second table's legitimate invoice plus penalties required by contract, but Daniel used the money first for wages and legal bills. His lease shortage remained. That unresolved pressure prevented the external victory from becoming a fantasy. Daniel returned to the cafe exhausted, unsure whether integrity had saved the business. Lily placed the red card beside the cash drawer and said a recipe could move without losing where it came from. Rosa presented the cooperative plan the next morning. Workers would buy gradual shares through payroll deductions, while the community property trust would purchase the building and cap rent. Daniel would keep creative control of the menu for 3 years, but no longer own every decision. He feared Maya's dream would disappear into committees. Rosa reminded him that Maya had named the cafe second table because the first table was never supposed to belong to one person. Daniel recognized the difference between preserving a memory and freezing it. He agreed to let the workers vote. Every employee approved the plan after independent review. The property trust still needed a stable service contract to finance the purchase. Harborlight issued an open request for proposals covering scholarship meals across 3 hotels, with the new worker committee scoring bids. Daniel refused to ask Vanessa for inside information. Second Table submitted its real costs, safety system, and token service design alongside 4 competitors. The process took weeks and could have ended without them. When the committee selected the cooperative, the victory belonged to transparent work, not Vanessa's affection or Arthur's private favor. Vanessa came to the café after the result became public and ordered soup at the regular price. Daniel served her but did not pretend the gala had vanished. She asked whether trust could return after a public act that would remain online forever. Daniel said trust was not the disappearance of evidence. It was what someone did while the evidence remained. Vanessa accepted that she might never be forgiven by every viewer or employee. Their closeness grew from shared work and honest limits, not from a dramatic declaration over a bowl. Arthur began volunteering 1 lunch each month under Rosa's supervision. He washed trays badly at first and resisted suggestions until Lily handed him a checklist. Daniel watched Arthur learn the humility he had once outsourced through philanthropy. Arthur's relationship with Vanessa improved because he asked before intervening and accepted no as a complete answer. The father and daughter repaired their pattern in parallel with Daniel and Lily repairing missed time. No family became perfect, but each gained a practice for making power visible before it caused harm. Lily designed a permanent token box for Second Table and painted a tiny red line around its edge. She refused requests to put her face on hotel brochures. Vanessa backed the refusal and used anonymous family feedback instead. Daniel attended every remaining school event that semester, even when it meant delegating a dinner service. Delegation frightened him less after the cooperative vote because responsibility no longer meant solitary control. Fatherhood changed his schedule, his ownership, and his definition of competence. Keeping a promise sometimes required building a system that could work without him. 3 months after the gala, the reformed scholarship dinner returned to Harborlight. Families and donors entered through the same doors and used identical meal tokens. The seating mixed workers, guests, and board members without a raised sponsor platform. Daniel supervised the kitchen with Mateo, while Rosa managed contracts. Vanessa checked labels at the pass, then stepped away when service began. The room looked less luxurious than the original gala, yet nobody had to stand in a marked line or explain why they belonged. Dignity appeared in procedures before it appeared in speeches. The opening course was Maya's tomato-basil soup. Daniel considered replacing it to avoid turning pain into ceremony, but Lily asked him to keep the recipe and leave the story private. He clipped a clean copy above the pass while the original red card remained in its sleeve at home. The distinction mattered. Memory could guide public work without becoming public property. When Vanessa lifted her bowl, several guests glanced toward their phones. She set it down carefully, met Daniel's eyes, and waited for service to continue without demanding a symbolic moment. Arthur stood at the head table again, this time only to move his chair into the shared seating circle. He made no announcement. A scholarship father beside him asked for extra bread, and Arthur passed the basket. Daniel saw the simple exchange from the kitchen and understood the payoff Arthur had hoped money could purchase but never could. Belonging arrived when nobody needed to perform gratitude. The man who once tested an institution from above now participated under rules he did not control, and that change carried more weight than applause. During cleanup, Vanessa found Daniel replacing a cracked ladle handle. She asked whether he would teach Harborlight managers the kitchen audit method. Daniel proposed a paid course led by Mateo and Rosa, with workers owning the materials. Vanessa accepted and asked the procurement committee to review the contract. Their conversation held warmth, but neither used work as a shortcut into romance. They agreed to coffee on a Sunday when Lily was with Rosa's family, a small personal step after months of earned trust. The future stayed open rather than guaranteed. Gordon later pleaded guilty to falsifying safety records and repaid diverted funds under a settlement. The result mattered, but Daniel refused invitations to attend sentencing for cameras. Accountability belonged to the workers and families who had carried the risk, not to his image as a victorious victim. He spent that morning helping Lily rebuild a broken wheel on her café model. His practical skill reached its limit when the axle split, so he asked a neighbor with a workshop for help. Competence remained believable because Daniel still needed other people. Second table's cooperative first meeting lasted 3 hours and included arguments over schedules, menu prices, and Daniel's tendency to make decisions before asking. Rosa called him on it directly. Daniel felt the old reflex to defend sacrifice as authority, then recognized Arthur's mistake in himself. He reopened the vote and accepted a slower plan. The café survived, not because the good man finally gained power, but because he learned power required consent even when earned through labor. That lesson completed the story's institutional and personal mirror. On Maya's birthday, Daniel and Lily closed the café early and cooked the soup together at home. Lily held the red card while Daniel measured by memory. She asked whether Maya would have forgiven Vanessa. Daniel said he could not use the dead to command the living, and forgiveness was not a debt Lily owed. They could remember harm and still notice repair. Lily placed the card back in its sleeve, then added one penciled note to her own copy. Leave room at the table for the person who admits the mistake. Vanessa spent that evening with Arthur at the hotel café. He apologized again for using private generosity to avoid shared governance. She told him his hidden tests had helped Gordon thrive by making every process depend on personal trust. Arthur accepted the correction and transferred his remaining foundation authority to the independent committee. Vanessa did not need Daniel present to choose differently. Her agency continued beyond the relationship, proving that change had become practice rather than performance. She sent Daniel no sentimental message, respecting the family day he had protected. 6 months later, Lily presented a new school project about cooperative businesses. Daniel sat in the front row beside Rosa and Mateo. When Lily described second table, she did not mention the viral gala or Vanessa's name. She explained that a business became safer when the people closest to a problem could stop the line. Daniel recognized his kitchen rule transformed into his daughter's civic language. He had missed one presentation and could never erase that fact, but he had changed the structure of his life so the mistake did not become a pattern. After the presentation, Vanessa waited in the hallway rather than entering uninvited. Lily waved her inside and showed the revised model. Vanessa asked permission before photographing the token box, and Lily said no because a classmate had helped build it. Vanessa put away her phone without argument. Daniel noticed that tiny response more than any board speech. Respect had become visible in the moment. No audience rewarded it. Lily then invited Vanessa to breakfast, not as a prize for Daniel, but because Vanessa had learned to hear a boundary. The breakfast was ordinary. Pancakes arrived late, Arthur complained about decaf, and Mateo teased Daniel for burning one batch while answering a supplier call. No one announced a new family. Vanessa helped Lily repair a paper sign, then asked Daniel about Sunday's coffee. The affection between them rested beside grief, work, and caution rather than replacing those things. Daniel said yes. Lily rolled her eyes and passed the syrup. The new reality was not wealth or status. It was a table where choices could be spoken without fear of losing one's place. Daniel kept the stained gala linen folded in a box beneath the cafe office shelf. He did not display it, but he used a small, clean square from the edge to line the cooperative's first account book. The object that had recorded humiliation now protected a shared ledger. Maya's red card remained separate, preserved as family memory rather than evidence. One object changed meaning through the story, while the other retained its boundary. Daniel understood that healing did not require turning every wound into branding. Some reminders served best when few people knew where they were. When Harbor Light published its annual safety report, it listed every stopped service, corrected label, and retaliation complaint alongside financial results. Vanessa included the gala incident under her own name. Investors complained that the report exposed weakness, but worker turnover fell and insurance costs followed. The reform did not make kindness magically profitable. It made hidden costs measurable. Daniel's course trained managers to ask who could stop a line and what happened after they did. Competence became a distributed habit rather than a heroic intervention reserved for crisis. Arthur's health declined gently, and he began eating lunch at second table twice each week. He paid with the same token as everyone else and waited when the counter was busy. Sometimes guests recognized him, but Rosa discouraged special treatment. Arthur found relief in not directing the room. Daniel found compassion without forgetting the damage caused by Arthur's old habits. Their friendship grew through repeated ordinary encounters, proving that dignity could survive unequal histories when rules no longer bent around the powerful person. The final scholarship dinner of the year ended without a speech. Families packed leftovers in identical containers, staff closed the verified logs, and Vanessa signed the report after Mateo. Daniel turned off the pass lights and checked his phone. Lily had sent a photograph of 2 front-row seats reserved for her winter recital, one for him and one for whoever he trusted to keep him there. He smiled at the constraint. Success no longer meant being indispensable everywhere. It meant knowing which promise only he could fulfill and building the rest with others. At the recital, Daniel arrived 20 minutes early. Vanessa joined him only after Lily confirmed the invitation, and Arthur watched by live stream from home. Lily played a short piano piece Maya once hummed while cooking. Daniel felt grief without treating it as a command to remain alone. He applauded when the final note ended, fully present in the seat he had promised. The viral gala had begun with food poured out as if his labor and memory were disposable. The story ended with attention given freely, something no contract or fortune could substitute. Later, Lily asked Daniel what he had learned from the worst night of their year. He told her dignity was not silence, pride, or winning the room. It was the discipline of naming harm without becoming controlled by it, accepting help without surrendering consent, and creating rules strong enough to protect people when good intentions failed. A table became just when anyone could question the person at its head and still keep a seat. Daniel had once believed protecting his family meant carrying every burden alone. He now understood that a father also protects by choosing trustworthy hands and teaching his child that love never cancels a boundary. If you had been in Daniel's place, would you have stayed to expose the altered records or left to protect your child from the fight? Share the choice you would make, and if stories about dignity, accountability, and second chances matter to you, like the video and subscribe for the next one.